Working at a funeral home is not what people think it is. It's not the constant chill of the embalming room or the sickly sweet scent of preservation chemicals that gets to you, it's the silence. The kind of silence so dense it clings to your skin, settles into your lungs, and makes you doubt your own thoughts. The kind that turns every creak of the building, every shift in the dim overhead lights, into something unnatural. It was a job I had grown used to, or at least, I thought I had. But something changed last week. It started with a single, small thing, so minuscule I almost ignored it. A corpse, a man in his late 50s, already drained, cleaned, and dressed for the viewing, had his hands neatly folded over his chest. I was certain of that. But when I returned from a brief break, the hands were different. One had slipped slightly, the fingers curled inward as if grasping at something. I told myself I must have knocked the table. Maybe the muscles contracted post-mortem. Logical explanations. But the body wasn't in rigor anymore. There was no reason for it to move at all. That night, as I prepped another body, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint, barely perceptible sound, a slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap, like fingernails against wood. It was coming from the cold storage drawers, the kind that line the walls like an industrial morgue. I froze, my gloved hands tightening on the embalming scalpel. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I considered the obvious, the cooling system clicking, pipes settling. But then it came again, sharper this time, like someone knocking from inside. I forced myself to move, to step closer, my heartbeat pounding in my throat as I reached for the handle. My fingers trembled as I unlatched the door, the metal cold against my skin. The drawer slid out with a groan of steel against steel, revealing a lifeless body wrapped in a white sheet. The air inside was frigid, the kind that burns your lungs, but it wasn't the temperature that made me step back. It was the sight of the corpse's face. The mouth, previously shut, stitched neatly like protocol demanded, was slightly parted now, and something dark, something wet, glistened between its lips, like it had been trying to speak. I don't know how long I stood there, my legs locked in place as my mind scrambled for a reasonable explanation. I stared at that slack jaw, at the darkened tongue that should have been dry and shriveled but instead glistened, moist, too fresh. Then, before I could even process it, the lights flickered. The air shifted. A sound, low, guttural, not quite a groan but something deeper, seeped into the silence. My own breathing became ragged, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then, as the fluorescent lights above me buzzed and stuttered, the corpse's head tilted. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. I swear to God, it moved. I did what anyone with an ounce of sanity would do. I shoved the body back into the freezer, slammed the drawer shut, and locked it. But the moment I turned away, before I could take a single step toward the exit, I heard it. A voice, barely a whisper, curling against my ear like cold breath in the dark. "You're not supposed to be here." I barely remember leaving the cold storage that night. I must have slammed the doors, locked up with trembling hands, and practically sprinted to my car, but the details blur in my mind, lost in the suffocating panic that gripped me. The voice, I could still hear it, soft as a breath, curling around my ears like something alive. It hadn't been a trick of my imagination. It had come from the corpse. It had spoken. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, those half-parted lips, the dark stain inside its mouth, the slow tilt of its head. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart hammering against my ribs, the echo of that whispered phrase crawling through my skull like a parasite. "You're not supposed to be here." But what did that mean? Was it a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? The next night, I did everything in my power to avoid going near that storage unit. I focused on surface-level preparations, polishing caskets, setting up the viewing rooms, rearranging floral arrangements that didn't need rearranging. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to give myself an excuse to not go back there. But I could feel it, that wrongness creeping in from the edges of my vision, like a shadow stretching just beyond the reach of the lights. The air inside the funeral home felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, exhaustion, stress, but deep down, I knew better. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the whispering started again. This time, I wasn't anywhere near the bodies. I was in the front office, staring blankly at a half-finished report, when I heard it, faint, distorted, barely human. My name. It slithered through the silence, curling in the corners of the room like smoke. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't coming from the mortuary. It was coming from inside my own office. I didn't want to look. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to keep my eyes on the desk, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, to pack up my things and leave. But some horrible, instinctual part of me forced my head to turn, slow and mechanical, toward the source of the sound. The small, dust-covered radio sitting on the shelf, a radio I hadn't touched in months, was on. The static was thick and warbling, twisting around itself like it was trying to form something coherent, something real. Then, as the screen flickered, as the dials moved on their own, I heard it again, the same voice. The same whisper. And this time, it said something different. Not my name. Not a warning. It laughed. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that office, staring at the flickering radio as the distorted, broken laughter slithered out of it. The sound wasn't normal. It wasn't human. It had this warbled, guttural depth, something that sounded too real and too wrong at the same time, like a recording that had been played backward and forward all at once. My fingers twitched against the desk. The air felt colder, thick and oppressive, like I had just stepped into a room where I wasn't supposed to be. My first instinct was to turn it off, but the moment I reached for the dial, the laughter stopped. Dead silence. I barely had time to exhale before the radio crackled again. This time, it whispered something else, something so quiet and distant that I had to strain to hear. 3 words. Check the body. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't want to. I knew which body it meant. The hallway back to the mortuary felt longer than it should have. My shoes scuffed against the linoleum, and every flicker of the overhead lights made me flinch, my breath hitching in my throat as I stepped back into the embalming room. The air smelled sharper now, tinged with something metallic, something sour, something that shouldn't have been there. The cold storage unit was closed, just as I had left it, but I knew before I even reached for the handle, that something was waiting for me on the other side. My pulse pounded in my ears as I gripped the metal and pulled. The drawer slid open with a groan, the kind of sound that made my bones vibrate. And there it was. The corpse, pale and still beneath the dim fluorescent lights. Except it wasn't the same. Its arms were no longer at its sides. One hand had shifted. Bent inward, fingers curled around something. Clutching something. I felt the cold sweat prickle down my spine as I forced myself to look closer. In its grip, a piece of paper, crumpled, stained dark with something that looked too much like dried blood. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and pried it loose, my own hands trembling as I unfolded it. There was only one sentence scrawled across it, written in jagged, uneven letters, as if the ink had been scratched into the page rather than written. They're not resting. The air in the room shifted. A low, creaking sound came from behind me, and I turned, too fast, heart hammering, vision swimming with the sheer wrongness of it all. One of the other storage drawers was opening. On its own. The latch unhooked with a soft, metallic snap, and the steel door inched outward, slow and deliberate, as if something inside was pushing it open. I couldn't move. My breath hitched, the cold slithering into my bones, and then, the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't from the radio. This time, it was right behind me. The kind of whisper that's felt more than heard, a breath curling against my skin in the dead silence of the room. You should have left. I turned. The corpse's eyes were open. I don't remember running. I don't remember moving at all. One moment, I was frozen in place, staring into the open, glassy eyes of a corpse that should have been resting, should have been dead, and the next, I was gasping for breath in the front office, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone. I dialed 911. My fingers slipped against the screen, slick with sweat, but before I could press call, the lights cut out. The funeral home plunged into a darkness so complete, so suffocating, that for a split second, I thought I had lost my sight entirely. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It wasn't the kind of stillness I had grown used to in this place. It was heavy. It was watching. Then, movement. Not footsteps. Not the distant creak of wood settling. Something else. Something skittering. I fumbled my way to the surveillance room, knocking over a stack of old records in my blind panic. The dim glow of the monitor screens was the only light source, bathing the cramped space in a sickly green tint. I forced myself to sit, forced my hands to steady as I rewound the last few hours of footage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I told myself I needed to see. I needed proof. I needed something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. But the moment the footage reached 3:14 a.m., the screen glitched. The frames distorted, warping, stretching the image into something unnatural. And then, just as suddenly, the static cleared. My stomach dropped. The cold storage drawer was open. The same drawer I had locked. The same drawer I had run from. And in the dim, flickering light of the embalming room, the corpse sat up. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like something struggling against invisible strings, head twitching, shoulders rolling forward as if adjusting to its own weight. Then, slowly, too slowly, it turned toward the camera. Its mouth fell open, but it wasn't screaming. It wasn't gasping. It was smiling. My breath stopped, my entire body locking up as I watched its lips move, forming words that had no sound. But I didn't need to hear them. I could read them. I see you. And just as I thought it couldn't get worse, just as my brain began to process the impossible reality unfolding before me, the corpse snapped its head upward, eyes staring directly into the lens, directly at me. The monitor cut to black. The entire building groaned. And somewhere, deep within the walls of the funeral home, something knocked. I don't know how long I sat there, my breath coming in ragged, uneven gulps as the monitor remained black, the funeral home drowning in a silence so thick it felt like a presence in itself. The air had shifted. It was different now, not just cold, but wrong, like something unseen had slithered its way into the walls, into the floors, into the very air I was breathing. My hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but before I could react, before I could even fully process what I had just seen, the silence shattered. The sound was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate creak, the kind that only came from metal bending under pressure. It was coming from the embalming room. The same room where the corpse had moved. I forced myself to stand, my legs feeling weak beneath me as I pushed away from the desk. My entire body was telling me to run, to leave this cursed place and never come back, but my feet carried me forward, step by agonizing step, toward the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting eerie, flickering shadows along the corridor walls as I inched closer to the open door of the embalming room. The scent of chemicals and decay hung heavy in the air, thicker than before, suffocating. And then, as I reached the threshold, I saw it. The storage drawer. The one I had locked. It was open again. The gurney had been pulled out, the sheet still draped over the body, motionless. For a long, terrible moment, I thought, maybe it didn't move, maybe I imagined it, maybe I'm losing my mind. But then, with a slow, shuddering breath, the body beneath the sheet sat up. The fabric slipped away, revealing pale, waxy skin, lifeless eyes that shouldn't have been open, lips that curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. My entire body seized up, my blood turning to ice as it moved, not like a person, not like something alive, but with a jerking, unnatural rhythm, as though it was fighting against the very concept of being dead. Its head snapped toward me, its gaze locking onto mine, and before I could even think of turning to run, it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, layered, as if 100 voices were whispering through it at once. "You've seen too much." My breath caught in my throat, my vision swimming as my legs finally obeyed, propelling me backward out of the room. But as I turned to flee, I realized with horror I wasn't alone. The other storage drawers, they were opening. One by one. And the bodies inside were waking up. I ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I bolted down the dimly lit hallway, my breath ragged and shallow, my pulse a deafening drumbeat in my ears. The funeral home wasn't large, but in that moment, it felt like an endless labyrinth of darkened corridors and flickering lights, twisting and shifting with every frantic step I took. The sound of the storage drawers creaking open behind me was a nightmare made real, the metal scraping like nails against bone, like something crawling free from a place it was never meant to leave. My body screamed at me to keep moving, to get out, to get away from whatever was waking up behind me. But then, just as I reached the exit leading into the main hall, I stopped. Something was wrong. The heavy metal doors that led to the mortuary were wide open, but the gurney inside was empty. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward, hesitantly, my hands trembling as I reached for the sheet that had once covered the corpse. It lay crumpled on the floor, stained with something dark and wet, something that smelled rotten, metallic, wrong. My mind screamed for me to turn around, to leave this place and never look back, but my body refused to move, my gaze locked onto the empty space where the body should have been. And then, in the suffocating silence, I heard it. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Not behind me. Not from the mortuary. From above. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I tilted my head upward. The ceiling vents. They were open. The metal grate hung loose, barely clinging to the frame, and something pale and thin, something with fingers too long and too sharp, was gripping the edge. My breath hitched, a strangled, involuntary noise escaping my throat as I saw it. The corpse. Crawling. Its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its movements jerky, inhuman, as it dragged itself along the ceiling like a grotesque marionette, its empty eye sockets fixed on me, its mouth parted in a silent, grinning scream. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring as the lights flickered violently, casting its grotesque silhouette in flashes of sickly yellow. And then, in the briefest moment of darkness, it dropped. I hit the floor hard. My vision blurred from the impact, my lungs spasming in a desperate attempt to pull in air. My body screamed at me to move, to get up, but my mind lagged behind, stuck in the horror of what I had just seen. That thing, it wasn't just the corpse anymore. It wasn't just dead flesh moving where it shouldn't. It was aware. The way it had crawled, the way it had looked at me, its movements calculated, precise, not the mindless shuffling of something reanimated. It had intelligence. It had purpose. And that realization was far worse than any rotting body shifting in the dark. The funeral home groaned, the very walls around me seeming to breathe, the silence no longer empty but filled with a presence I couldn't see, one that made the air thick, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. The room had changed. The doorway back into the main hall now stretched into shadow, deeper than it should have been, as if the darkness itself had grown thicker, more solid, swallowing any semblance of escape. And then, just beyond the dim emergency light flickering in the hallway, I saw them. The shadows. They weren't human. Not anymore. They loomed at the edges of the corridor, moving unnaturally, limbs elongated, heads tilted at wrong angles. Some stood completely still, watching. Others twitched violently, their bodies convulsing in ways no living thing ever should. And then, almost in unison, they turned toward me. A cold wave of terror slammed through me as they moved, not walking, not running, but shifting, appearing closer with each blink, like film frames cutting ahead in a movie missing too many sequences. My heart pounded, my muscles locked in place as I fought the overwhelming need to scream. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. And then, as my breath hitched in my throat, one of them, the nearest, its form barely distinguishable from the dark, opened its mouth. No sound came out at first, just the slow unhinging of a jaw that stretched too wide, the skin around it tearing, revealing something underneath, something glistening, raw, and moving. And then, in a voice layered with hundreds of whispers, voices overlapping, merging, breaking apart into incomprehensible echoes of something ancient, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled backward, my hands searching desperately for anything at all, that could prove I was still in reality, that this wasn't some twisted nightmare bleeding into the waking world. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. And whatever had been resting in this funeral home wasn't resting anymore. I don't remember running. I don't remember how my body obeyed while my mind screamed at me to shut down, to collapse, to accept whatever horror had already unraveled around me. But somehow, I moved. Somehow, I survived. The hallway warped as I stumbled forward, the walls pressing inward like a living thing, breathing, shifting, closing in. The whispers clawed at my ears, layered, incomprehensible, words spoken in a language older than time, older than death itself. Behind me, the shadows stretched, lengthening like grasping fingers, the figures within them growing taller, thinner, impossible. The thing that had spoken, the thing that had once been human, was still there, its mouth open too wide, its voice crawling through my bones, vibrating inside my skull. I didn't stop moving until I reached the basement door. The locked one. The one we were never allowed to enter. My hands fumbled for the keyring in my pocket, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my teeth. The door wasn't supposed to open. The owner, Mr. Holloway, had been clear about that. Never go downstairs. There's nothing there for you. But the key slid in too easily, the lock unfastening with a sickening click that echoed through the suffocating silence. And as the heavy wooden door groaned open, revealing the staircase that spiraled into the blackness below, I felt it. A pull. Something waiting. The air was wrong, too cold, too still, too aware. I took the first step. Then another. And another. Until the light from above flickered and died, sealing me in darkness. The basement smelled of earth, damp and old, like the kind of places where things are buried and forgotten. My flashlight flickered as I swept the beam across the concrete walls, my breath catching when I saw the markings, symbols carved into the stone, deep and deliberate, overlapping as if someone had tried to trap something inside. And then, I saw them. The caskets. Dozens of them, lined against the walls, stacked on top of each other, their lids secured with thick iron chains. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the scratches. Deep, jagged gashes in the wood, long and desperate, as if something had been clawing its way out. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as I stepped closer. Something shifted. A breath, not mine. A slow, shallow inhale from inside one of the caskets. Something still lived here. And before I could react, before I could run, the chains on the nearest casket snapped open. The sound of the iron chains snapping echoed through the basement like the crack of a bone breaking under pressure, sharp and unnatural, sending a wave of ice down my spine. The casket trembled, a deep groan of wood splitting as the lid began to rise on its own. My breath hitched, my fingers numb around the flashlight as I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, to leave, to never look back. But my body refused to obey. I was locked in place, forced to watch as a pale, withered hand pushed free from the casket's depths, its nails jagged, cracked, curling inward like claws. And then, it pulled itself up. The corpse shouldn't have been alive. Its flesh sagged against bone, skin stretched too tight over a face that should have rotted away long ago. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the face itself. It wasn't some nameless, forgotten dead thing. It was me. My own lifeless reflection stared back at me, its vacant eyes hollow, its lips parting in a grin that was too wide, too unnatural, like it was amused by my horror. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat, my pulse roaring in my ears. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But then, it moved. Its head tilted, twitching unnaturally as its voice, my voice, slithered through the stagnant air. You don't belong here. The words weren't spoken. They were felt. A vibration in my skull, crawling through my mind like something that had been buried in me long before I ever stepped foot in this place. My knees buckled as my duplicate lunged forward, its hands reaching, fingers stretching, pulling toward me. The flashlight flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows along the basement walls as the other caskets began to tremble. More chains snapping. More lids rising. More things waking up. I turned and ran, my heartbeat thundering against my ribs as I tore up the basement stairs. But before I reached the top, before I could escape, I heard it, the last thing I wanted to hear. My own voice, whispering from the dark behind me. You were never supposed to wake up either. I ran up the basement stairs, my lungs burning, my vision tunneling, every muscle in my body screaming for escape. The funeral home felt different now, as if the very walls had shifted, warping around me, stretching into something unfamiliar, something I had never really seen before. My own ragged breath echoed back at me, the sound bouncing in unnatural ways, distorted, overlapping, as if there were more of me. The air was thick with something invisible but crushing, pressing against my ribs, against my throat, whispering in voices that weren't mine but knew my name. I reached the main hallway, my fingers fumbling against the door, but the moment I touched it, it melted into the wall. There was no exit. There had never been an exit. The overhead lights flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows that moved without a source. I turned, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears as I saw them. The corpses. Not just the ones from the basement. All of them. Every body that had ever passed through this place, standing in the corridors, their mouths slightly open, their eyes empty but locked on me. They weren't moving. Not yet. But I could feel it, the weight of their awareness, the cold hunger in their gaze. And then, from the darkness behind them, it stepped forward. My duplicate. The corpse that looked exactly like me. Its mouth curled into something too wide, too unnatural, its head tilting as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. Not walking. Gliding. You never left, you know, it whispered, and the sound wasn't spoken, it was inside me, pressing into my mind, unraveling something I had refused to see. My vision blurred, memories crashing into me like breaking glass, the first night I started working here, the exhaustion, the moments I swore I had lost time, the whispers that had always been there. And then I saw it. The truth. The security footage. The missing hours. Me, lying cold and still on an embalming table, my chest unmoving, my skin pale. Not asleep. Dead. My stomach twisted, my body rejecting the reality my mind had already begun to accept. I wasn't supposed to wake up. But I did. And now, the things that rested here, the things that had always waited in the dark, were here to take me back. The walls trembled. The air crackled. The dead began to move. I turned, but there was nowhere left to run. The darkness closed in, swallowing the last sliver of light, and as my own reflection reached for me, as its frozen fingers pressed against my skin, I finally understood. I was never supposed to leave. Because I had never left at all.